channel. Adam is not able to be on tonight, so I'll be running the session. Tonight we have Peter, I'm not sure how you pronounce your last name, Pete.
Kalajian.
Kalajian, who's going to talk to us about flat frames and how to do them correctly and get good calibration. We don't have an image of the week this week, so I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Pete. Remember to post your questions in the YouTube comments, and we'll monitor those and ask Pete, and we'll hopefully get answers for everyone. All right, Pete, it is all yours.
All right, well, good evening, everybody, and I hope that by the end of this talk you'll have a little bit better understanding of what for some people is a little bit of a mysterious process, which is calibrating your images with flat field images. And I just want to give you a little background. I am sort of have dabbled in all sorts of amateur astronomy pursuits. I like to draw. I got involved in measuring exoplanet transits for a little while, which was an awfully fun thing to do that required tremendous care with calibration, and that led me to develop the flip flat and start a little company called Alnitak Astro Systems, which I subsequently sold to Optec, and they're doing a great job manufacturing the flip flaps and the flat man. And so the whole business started out of my interest in calibration and mostly for scientific work. I'm also interested in spectroscopy, and flat fielding plays a role in spectroscopy. Here's a couple of low-resolution spectra of a couple of bright stars. I'm also interested in photometry, and here's a great series of photometric observations of the SS Cygni outburst a couple of Septembers ago, about 4 Septembers ago, where we had so many clear nights that I was able to get the entire outburst almost completely. So that was a lot of fun. And notoriously lacking are my astro images, although all the astro images that you see on the presentation are mine, but I would by no means call myself an astro imager of any repute. I'm much more interested in scientific measurement, but the needs of a scientific imager in regards to flat fielding far outweigh the needs of aesthetic imagers. So everything I say here, if you follow along, you're going to have a very good picture of what flat fielding does, and what I'm going to say is sort of geared towards if you want the absolute perfectly photometrically flat images, but that photometrically flat images also is a great start for a fantastic aesthetic image. So that being said, I'm just going to jump in to the background, and hopefully this will be real review for most of you, and so we'll go pretty quick, but if you have questions, then post them and we can slow down. A flat field is a field that you take a camera image taken exposing the camera to a uniform source of light, and this is more difficult than you might think to do this so that you have a perfectly uniform illuminated source. So just a few things to remember about CCDs. One thing is that due to quantum mechanical considerations, we're going to introduce noise but I like to use a better term for noise, which is uncertainty of measurement. So the camera is a measuring device, and it's measuring effectively how many photons are arriving in any pixel, but there's an uncertainty of measurement due to the fact that we have this quantum noise, but we also have pixel-to-pixel variation in every CCD chip, so that no two pixels are identical in their response to photons. And then we also put this camera behind a stream in a downstream of an optical train, which is going to introduce, at the very least, some vignetting on the edges, and finally, and probably as important to most aesthetic imagers, the dust on the cover slide of the CCD and on the filters is going to introduce shadows that need to be compensated for in the final image. So you can't do anything about noise with a flat field, but you can take care of pixel-to-pixel variation, vignetting, and dust using a good flat field. Here is a graphical representation of what the flat field does. Here's a raw image taken by Steve Maslin, flat field image taken by Steve Maslin. Here's a little funny little pixel defect in the camera. Here's the pixel defect showing up in one of his images down on the bottom left. And this is the pixel defect that shows up in the image just multiplied. This is with no flat, but if you calibrate the image with the flat, boom, that pixel variation, the pixel defect on the camera goes away. So that's the basic background of flats. Hopefully that was complete review for most of you, but if you have questions about that, feel free to ask. This might be an appropriate point. Is there anything that you might want to ask at that?
I haven't seen any questions yet, Peter. So
okay, good. So that we're talking to the pros from Dover. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about the math, and I think this is the part that I think if part one everybody was like, yep, yep, yep. Here's the part that maybe you might not be quite as familiar with. But this is it. This is the basic calibration math, and a fairly simple equation that you're going to do this on every pixel. You're going to perform this operation on every pixel. You're going to subtract a dark frame from both the raw image of whatever object that you're interested in, and you're going to also subtract a dark frame from the flat frame. Typically your calibration software will do this pretty seamlessly in the background, but what we really have to do, whoopsie, sorry. What we really have to do is to, let's see if we can get that out of the way. Nope. Sorry. We have to normalize this denominator, and by normalizing, basically what we're going to do is take the actual value and turn it into something that's near 1, and that will become apparent here in a second. Let's see. So this denominator then is what does the calibration, and if this is greater than, if this flat frame for any pixel, if this normalized flat frame is exactly 1, then nothing will change in the pixel of your image. If this flat frame value is greater than 1, then the final pixel value will be lower, and if it's less than 1, the final pixel value will be higher. And that's the whole shoot and match in terms of the math of flat frame calibration. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail with an example, how the normalization works. So imagine that we have 4 pixels here. It's a small sensor with just 4 pixels. And this is the value of the dark corrected flat frame. So we've taken a picture of an even source of illumination, and here are the results of the each pixel value at the end of the exposure. And we've got a nice even light source, which is absolutely essential for this all to work. If we take the average of those 4 pixels, we're going to get an average of 100. So what we're going to do is average all the pixel values for all the pixels in the flat image, the dark corrected flat image, and divide each pixel by that average of the entire sensor to get the normalized value. So here's what the normalized values would be. We have 100 is the average, so where any pixel that's 100 will get a normalized value of 1, and any pixel that is over 100 will get a normalized value over 1, and under 100 will get a normalized pixel value of under 1. So you can see how the normalization works, and of course this is done to every pixel in the image. Hopefully this is done correctly in your image processing software. So it's really part of the reason why I think that flat field calibration is perhaps understood or misunderstood, is the fact that it's all background stuff. It happens in the background, and you don't. It's kind of a black box calibration that you don't know what's going on. And the more you know, the more you can sort of diagnose what might be happening with your images when there's a problem. So going further, we take the normalized flat to our image frame. So now here's our raw frame minus dark frame. So this is the dark corrected raw frame. Again, it's a very small CCD, just 4 pixels. But let's see how the flat frame math works. So we're going to divide these values by the normalized flat frame. So remember that those were derived from the taking a flat field image and normalizing it. And let's see what happens to the final calibrated frame numbers. Well, the first top left pixel doesn't change its value, but you could see that the top right pixel has been attenuated by quite a bit. It was too bright, and the bottom left pixel was too dim. Perhaps there was a shadow of a piece of dust, or it was in the vignetted part of the image. So that had to be boosted. So you can see that after the division by the normalized flat, you now have pixel values that have been boosted or attenuated based on the calibration data from the flat field. So now we were talking before we started the presentation about how come I still have a dust donut after I did my careful flat field calibration. And here's my attempt to answer that question, and that is that the dark subtraction is absolutely essential, and here's why. So back to our raw flat field frame. If we subtract the 10 ADU of dark noise, we end up with this flat minus dark frame. So let's see what the consequences so there's our normalized values in red. But look at the difference between the normalized values in the raw flat frame versus the flat minus dark frame. They're different. And so you would boost the or attenuate the values differently than if you had correctly subtracted the dark frame. So if you have normalized values that are too low, you're going to when you divide, you're going to have a problem with overcorrection. If your normalized values are too high, you're going to have undercorrection. Let me go back to that slide. You're going to have undercorrection, which means that you would not boost the pixel value enough to totally eliminate the dust donut shadow. So the key take-home message of this slide is the dark subtraction must be correct for the particular frame. For that dark frame has to be subtracted from the flat frame correctly. And the problem that I've seen in the field is that many of you do darks on a very infrequent basis and then wonder, well, why do I still have a dust donut in my images? And I would bet you in 100%, maybe I shouldn't say 100, but in 99% of the cases, it's because the camera's dark noise characteristics have changed over time, and that dark noise characteristic, even if you're taking flats at the same temperature as your flat field images, you can't guarantee that a dark you took 6 months ago is going to have the same, is going to be the same dark that you're going to get today. So my practice and scientific imaging is to take darks on a very frequent basis. And again, depending on your camera may be more stable or less stable, but if you're seeing flat issues, in other words, less than correction for vignetting or dust donuts, I would bet that it would be a problem with your dark frames. Hopefully that makes sense. Are there any questions on that? Because this is a really important point.
We do have one question. So someone, Hamza Tahami, hopefully I didn't butcher the name, asked, to be correct, one needs to shoot dark flats as well as regular flats?
Okay, I'm not sure what that question means, but I'm going to interpret it that if we go back to the original equation, let's see if I can get back there. There it is. So what you need to do is, and again, this is done in your image processing software, but like I know in Maxim, there's a little check mark that says something like, should I bias correct the flats or dark correct the flats? Well, a bias frame is really just a dark frame of very, very short duration. So typically, the dark noise does not accumulate in a matter of a few seconds the image exposure length of your flats. So you could, wherever in the flat minus dark frame, you might say flat minus bias frame, because a 5-second dark frame and a bias frame are going to have virtually identical characteristics. So if you were to take, if you have different filters and you take flats and one of them is 7 seconds and one of them is 5 seconds and one of them is 6 seconds, you could take a set of flats of each of those durations, or you could just use a bias frame as your dark correction. And I think this distinction between dark frames and bias frames, a better way to think of bias frames is they are zero duration dark frames. Would be a better way of putting them. So does that answer the question?
So Hamza says that his red flats are around 40 seconds long, And his other statement was that a dark flat, what he's referring to as a dark flat, is a dark that matches the length of the flat frame, the exposure length.
Yes. Okay, so if he's taking 40-second flats, then probably he would want to take a dedicated 40-second dark and use that 40-second dark to dark correct his flat frames. That's correct. Yeah, I would say that anything over a 10-second duration, probably the bias frames are might start to diverge a little bit from the. But again, you could try it out. See if you're seeing that your images are not well corrected using biases for short duration flats, then you could go to dedicated dark flat darks, if you will, of the same duration as the flat frames. If you're doing exoplanet transits, yes, my darks are exactly the same length as my flats for the in that dark frame subtraction. If I'm doing static imaging and I don't have a lot of dust donuts and the vignetting in my optical system is not profound and I try it with biases and it seems to be working, then keep it simple. I hope that's the answer.
I'll also add that from practical experience with my Sony sensor, I can probably get away with 40-second, flats and still use a bias frame. But with a KAF sensor, I definitely see issues at exposures that long and have had to take dark flats along with the flats.
There you go. Okay, let me get back to where we were. Okay. Right. So the other important thing to remember is that bad pixels have an impact on your dark subtraction, because remember, the normalization is done by averaging the dark frame pixel values. So if you have some dead pixels, some dark pixels, and you don't, and again, certain image processing programs automatically throw out zero value pixels out of the average. They they say, okay, that's a dead pixel. I'm not going to use that in the average. But depending on the image processing software, you might want to find out about that. Here's a histogram of a flat, and you can see that there's there's some bad pixels that have been included in this sensor, have some bad pixels that don't register the pixel intensity correctly, and those are going to mess up the average. There should be some sort of a smooth profile in the histogram, and there shouldn't be these outliers of pixels. And you can see now we're talking about a couple of hundred pixels that are out of a large sensor that are completely out of the distribution. But those pixels need to be taken care of, because otherwise they're going to skew the flat. They're going to skew the normalization process, because the darks, the flats are going to have those bad pixels. So that's an important thing to remember. Okay. So it will overcorrect the images, and depending on if you have a lot of bad pixels and they're not taken care of, if you don't have a bad pixel map, you could overcorrect. But if you're talking about 1 or 2 pixels, it's not going to affect the average enough to matter. Okay, now this is very important to understand the importance of exposing your flat images in the linear regime of your anti-blooming camera. The way you want to think about it is, if you had a linear detector that as you gathered more photons, the ADU values would correspondingly go up in a linear fashion. So if you doubled your photons arriving at the detector, the ADU values that you read would go up double. But at some point on every anti-blooming camera, there is a point where some of those photons are lost, and so that you are underrepresenting the actual light values that hit the detector. And that roll-off, and in this picture it's where the red line starts to droop below the linear response. That place where the detector becomes nonlinear is absolutely essential to know. And so if I was going to make any commercial, it would be that when you get a new camera, or if you haven't done this with your old camera, it should be the very first thing you do the next time you're able to get with your equipment and take some images, because it's absolutely essential that your flat values are taken, that you take flats whose maximum ADU value does not go above the linear, the point of nonlinearity on your detector. So and of course you're going to have overcorrection of your images, meaning that the pixel values will be boosted beyond where they should be, and you'll have bright spots. Your dust donuts might show up as little bright donuts as opposed to dark donuts. So this is an important thing. Typically, the way people sort of hedge their bets on this one is they say, well, I'll just take my flats at 30K ADU because I'm sure that's way down below the nonlinear point, and so I'll be sure that I'm in the linear regime. That's true, but what you're doing is sacrificing the benefit of having higher ADU value flats, meaning less noise. You're sacrificing the possibility that maybe you can get to 50K ADU when you're still in the linear regime. The brighter your flats are, the less measurement, the less that quantum noise affects your images, the less measurement uncertainty there is. The signal-to-noise ratio goes up. So you want to have flats that have the highest signal-to-noise ratio that you possibly can have while still being in the linear regime. So that being said, there's a number of ways to characterize the linearity of your detector, and probably there's that is a subject for an entirely different talk. But you can do it a number of ways. You can use CCD Autopilot's automatic linearization characterizer. And if you can read my Sky and Telescope article that talks a little bit about how to go about characterizing your linearization, and there's tons of resources online too. Okay, so any questions on that?
We don't have any other questions. We do have one other comment though. Elizabeth Warner says that bias value could describe it as a very short exposure dark frame is technically a zero exposure frame to compensate for the added charge in order for the CCD to work.
That's correct. But the fact of the matter is that bias will show if you actually had if you read the dark frame sensor at a very short time limit, say a quarter of a second, the quantum noise that would build up beyond the bias would be a imperceptible amount. So you could sort of, the way I like to think about it is that it's kind of a zero, just from a conceptual understanding, you could think of the bias is going to be identical to a short duration dark frame, a very short duration dark frame.
Yeah. She also asks, do you know which issue that article's in Sky and Telescope?
If you go to the Alnitak Astro website, Alnitak Astro Systems, I think it's alnitakastro.com. There is there's some resources in there, and I think there's a reprint on that website. I can't remember. Sorry, I don't know the issue.
Yeah, there's a lot of resources out there for determining linearity.
Yes, there are. Okay, so let's go on to, what are we at, part 3? I've lost track. What makes a good flat? So the sort of gold standard is you've got to point your camera at something that illuminates the camera or the optical system evenly across the entire imaging plane. And so that's the number one goal, is evenness of illumination. Again, we want to have ADU values at the upper range of the linear regime of a CCD detector to get the highest signal-to-noise ratio. We want to have at least a 2-second flat so that we eliminate the effects of shutter latency, which is you don't want there to be parts of the detector that have been exposed for longer time than other parts of the detector. So if you think about the shutter sweeping across the detector, if you take very, very short exposures, then one side of the detector is going to be illuminated for, or depending on whether it's an iris type shutter or a linear type shutter. So a 2-second minimum, and that's a rule of thumb, 2 seconds or greater for a flat field length. Obviously the more dark frames you use, the less uncertainty of measurement. Your signal-to-noise ratio goes up as the number of dark frames that you use. And the same will be said of, because, as we all know, more is better in terms of signal-to-noise ratio, of course, with diminishing returns. And of course, bad pixels should be removed with a bad pixel Mac or via darks. Okay, so those are the things you want to think about in getting a good flat. Okay, some noise considerations about flats in general is that you want to make sure that you have a lots of a good signal to noise ratio flats, meaning high in the ADU values and in the linear range, and you want to make sure that you're combining a pretty good number of them, and the same with your darks, you're combining a good number of them so that you have good noise statistics. We talked about that already. This is more for the crazy exoplanet photometers, but again, you're trying to get as many photons as you can per flat in order to increase that signal-to-noise ratio. And that being said, no matter what, you are adding some measurement uncertainty to your images, which we call, and most people call measurement uncertainty noise. So you just want to be careful, because you're adding some uncertainty. So that's a drawback to get the gain of having evenness, so getting rid of the pixel-to-pixel variation, the vignetting, and the dust donuts. Okay, how do you get them? This is, it's all well and good to know what they are and what the math is and what the best practices are for calibration. But I think for some of us, the getting those good flat frame images, finding a light source that is even, is probably one of the most difficult and challenging things. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. The professional astronomers that are looking for the absolute best possible flat field images are doing what they call all sky flats, which is what some amateurs refer to incorrectly. They use that word all sky flats, but an all sky flat is really taking a picture of a dark region of the night sky for hundreds of hours and using that as your flat frame. It's not something that any amateur would ever do, but just yeah, go ahead.
I was going to interrupt. I've heard that referred to in the amateur community as nighttime sky flats.
Yes. So those are things that unless you're trying to do some very finicky photometry, you wouldn't attempt. I can't imagine any reason to attempt it, especially because you're going to, typically we stretch our images and that sort of fidelity is completely unnecessary. You can use homemade light boxes. The standard was Twilight Flats, which sometimes people call sky flats. There's ways to illuminate the inside of a dome or a sheet in the inside of a dome with some sort of light source. And then, then my contribution to the war effort was to introduce the commercially available electroluminescent panels. I talked about the all sky flats, but I think we could just move past them pretty quickly. Your Twilight flats can sometimes work quite well. However, if you have a full set of filters that you have to acquire flats for, you're racing against the clock. The neutral point, which is where you want to point your telescope so that there's no gradient of sunlight, is moving all the time as the sun is rising or setting. And forget about it in wide field imaging. If you are doing some sort of short focal length telescope and a big sensor, you're virtually guaranteed to have gradients due to the flatting process using Twilight Flats. And of course, you can have possible star artifacts even if you do median combines. And again, it's tough. It's tough to do these Twilight Flats, especially if you've got narrow band filters, which require a lot of time. So, I gave up on Twilight Flats a long time ago, and for a number of reasons. Is you don't know what you get. Maybe you get a good set one night, and the next night there was a passing high cloud, or you miss the neutral point. Who knows what? But you just don't know. You won't know whether your flats are good until you do the calibration and then go, oh crap, I just introduced a gradient, or oh look, there's star artifacts. Who knows what? So personally, I think Twilight Flats are a crapshoot. Light boxes can work well. I built a carefully baffled light box when I was first starting out. It worked really well. They're bulky. They're hard to you got to go out to your observatory and put it on and take it off. But they do pretty good job of providing an even source of illumination depending on the design, and you have to be careful with your baffling and corners. You have to baffle the corners so that there's no hard spots in the corners. But they do work. Okay, having invented and marketed and I would say reasonably perfected these electroluminescent panels, I probably would be biased towards them. I don't have any fiduciary interest in the panels anymore. I sold off my interest. I don't make any money from Optic anymore. But I believe that they're good and they work well. They're repeatable, and you know what you're getting every time. So I'm a big fan of electroluminescent panels, and Optech is making them in really big custom sizes for professional observatories that are doing photometric surveys. We sold quite a few of the big panels to sort of undergraduate observatories around the country, and more and more, I think Optech is selling them to research institutions around the world. So they seem to have been working pretty well, primarily because of their repeatability. You know what you're going to get. It's going to be the same every time. They're easy to wall mount, so you can automate the taking of flats in an observatory by having your telescope slew to the panel. They're all automatic. You can control by software the illumination brightness and turn them on and off, etc. Yeah, you want to make sure that you're choosing a full spectrum panel because you need photons in all your filter wavelengths. So a full spectrum panel like Optech makes works quite well. And of course, you do need some sort of brightness control, because if you have narrowband filters and broadband filters, you need a very bright source for your narrowband, but you need to be able to dim it right down for your wideband filters. We went to great lengths to control the brightness, because especially in if you're taking a long series of narrowband filter flats, and the values change over the course of that, the ADU values change over the course of the flat acquisition. When you go to combine them, you're gonna have some statistical errors. This is the output of a typical panel that Optech uses in their panels, and you can see that there's enough light across the spectrum, the visible spectrum, to work well. Okay, so now let's look at, you've got your flats, and you just want to know more about them, and you want to look and see if they're good, are there any problems, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can use flats to diagnose image train problems. So the first thing you want to do is just visually inspect your flat, and you know there should be some fairly even profile. If you take a line profile of your ADU values, it ought to look something like this. You know, if there's some unevenness, then you start to suspect problems. We'll talk about what problems you might see down the line. Smooth and symmetrical line profile. This one is a classic example of an off-center. You've got your optical axis and your camera axis are not aligned. So right away, if you look at your flat, you can go, whoops, that nice $100 camera adapter or focuser or what have you is sagging, and so and of course, if you take flats at different orientations and the vignetting is moving around and is not centered or doesn't maintain its off-centeredness in every orientation of the telescope, that's an indication that you have some optical axis problems. So that's kind of a handy trick for diagnosing optical train issues. I think that I'm going to kind of gloss over this next section because it's pretty. Here's a sort of an interesting thing that an electroluminescent flat for digital SLRs is far superior to Twilight Flats because you've got you've got the same ADU values for each of the RGB channels, whereas with a Twilight Flat, if you set your image for you set your exposure length to get a good blue flat, then you're going to underexpose your red flats. So that's something that a customer of mine brought up, which I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, so this is the part about how you can diagnose problems using flats. And I found this to be really interesting. This kind of came to my attention at AIC 5 or 7 or whatever, a lot of years ago when it's getting late. I'm starting to forget names, what have you. But he gave the fellow who was at SBIG for a number of years gave a great talk out there about diagnosing internal reflections in telescopes, and this came back to bite me on my telescope, and I want to show you a little bit about what I found about internal reflections and how electroluminescent flats are going to show you internal reflections and what that might look like. But there's some other things that you can see in flats. Here's an interesting one that a customer of mine, Doug Baum, sent me, with these strange striations and the sort of like embossed stamps. These are manufacturing, well, you might call them defects, but maybe that's the wrong word. They're manufacturing artifacts. They look bad, but they're completely correctable by flats. But you might see that on your camera and go, "What did I got a bad camera?" And you could argue with the manufacturer and say, "Hey, this one isn't. Give me another one." Even though you can completely correct these artifacts with flats. But if you see something like this, you can go, "Oh yeah." And I brought this up at AIC or NEAF at one point, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, those might have been Kevin Dixon was telling me about exactly what the manufacturing, what those were, and I don't remember, to tell you the truth, what exactly the manufacturing process that left those artifacts are."
We got one question that came up here.
Okay.
So Hamza asks, I'm using the Gerd Newman Aurora panel for my Explore Scientific with a 0.7x reducer, and at what point do you know you have too severe of fall off to be recovered by good flats?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand that question. Severe fall off.
I think what he's asking is, you see the vignetting in the corners or something like that. At what point is it too severe to be corrected by flats?
Oh, well, I would say that when you look at an image, you're looking at a screen transfer function, and you have no idea by looking at an image. You have to look at the statistics. If we go back to this picture here, that on the left looks like, oh my God, there's no light in the corners, but really you're talking about the difference between 23,000 ADU and 25,000 ADU. So I think that you can be fooled into looking at an image and saying, oh my God, I've got so much vignetting, when in fact, depending on how you set that screen histogram, it may be very mild. So I think that if your sensor is matched to your telescope, to the I think if you're trying to use a very large sensor on a telescope that is not set up for such a large sensor, then you're going to have issues that are going to be much more damning than the ability to flat them. In terms of, you're going to have all kinds of corner aberrations and what have you. So I don't think that. I think flats can pretty much take care of just about all vignetting.
I will add that I was working with a university at one point, and they had a scratch on one of their filters. And when you looked at the unstretched flat, you could see the stark line in the flat itself, and that one was not correctable, right? There was not enough signal in the area where it was really dark to actually correct the flat.
That would make sense, sure, because if you you can't infer what something is if there's no data. So yeah, of course.
There's one other question here. Is there any way to correct for very minor rotation in the position angle between the flat and light frames? I think this is Michelle. I think she's asking about, maybe you oriented the camera differently.
Okay, so I would say that if your camera sensor is on the optical axis of your telescope, and that there is no change in that relation depending on where you're pointed in the sky, and your rotator is concentric, then the answer is no, because virtually all of the optical vignetting from dust is going to be on the filters and or the cover plate. Dust on the other optical elements will not show up as a distinct shadow. It's too diffuse across the field. So rotator angle should have, again, with the caveat that you have a rotator that's rotating concentric to the optical axis, and the sensor on perpendicular and centered on the optical axis. Those things should make no difference.
And I'll just say one thing: if we haven't understood your question or anything, just chime back in and let us know, and we'll try to answer it.
Yeah. So the idea that you need to take a flat for every rotation angle is if you do need to take a different flat for every rotation angle, then what you have is problems with your optical train. Okay, so here's an example of an optical tube internal reflection problem. This one was on my telescope, and boy, didn't I have a hard time figuring out what the heck is this. Yeah, this was early in the development of the our flatman big panels, and this one had me really worried. In terms of what are we doing wrong? What's wrong with our flat panel? And over time, I realized, wait a minute. This is not the flat panels problem. This is the telescope OTA problem. And you can see from the histogram that there's this ring of dark and then a bright center. And this turns out that was due to internal reflections in the OTA, and this is a picture looking down the. I unmounted the camera from this Richie Chrétien and just took a picture, and you see those rings, bright rings around the donut in the middle is the secondary reflection, and then the first bright ring is the reflection off of one of the draw tube baffles, and then you can see a couple more internal reflections. It turns out that that wasn't the biggest part of the problem. The biggest part of the problem was the off-axis guider mechanism was a square off-axis guider element in the imaging train that was causing these bright reflections. And as soon as we took that off-axis guider out of the imaging train, the histogram returned to that nice symmetrical shape. So if you see any sort of histogram when you do a line profile of your flats that's not nice and symmetrical without any dips in it, then you've probably got some kind of internal reflection. And the one thing that the electroluminescent panels will do is, without any doubt, show you the problems in your imaging train, because you're talking about a bright source of light that's going to, it's going to, any sort of internal reflections are going to be exacerbated by the use of these bright electroluminescent panels. So you can think of it as a drawback to EL panels, or you can think of it as a benefit of EL panels because they help you to diagnose problems with your imaging train. Let's see.
We have one other question that came up here.
Yeah.
So Sean Harrison says that doing one-shot color CCD, my flat color channels are not exposed evenly. There's obvious separation in the histogram. At 25K ADU, the red channel seems to flat correctly, but the blue and green channels overcorrect. This is with a T-shirt sky flats and an LED flat panel. Any ideas?
Yeah, I would say that again, you with your one-shot camera, what you're going to have to do when you do the T-shirt sky flats is you're going to have to do 3 sets. One that you use, one that's exposed at the proper level for the red, one that's exposed at the proper level for for the green, and one for the blue. So even though you have a one-shot camera, you're going to need to take 3 separate sets of flats with ADU values that work for each of those channels. And the LED panels, I don't know what LEDs you're using, but if you look at the spectrum of an LED, basically you get 2. If it's a white LED, you get sort of 2 peaks, and you don't actually get across the spectrum illumination. So you may be with your LED panels, you may be missing one of your, there may just not be much light in one of the color channels.
Yeah, I have a friend who has a multi-spectrum flat frame device that he's been working on. He's using a Sloan filter set, and he has independent control of each of the LED groups he has in the device, so he can control what brightness for each spectrum so that he can balance things out if he needs to. Now he's not using a one-shot color camera, but it would actually be quite good for that type of thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, realistically speaking, you'd want blue LEDs for the blue channel, red LEDs for the red channel, and green LEDs for the green channel, because then you're going to get much better, illumination through those. filters. Let's see, what's next? Oh, here's another one. This one was really interesting. This sort of square vignetting, and then the diamond-shaped vignetting on the inside. This was a customer that I worked with. Typically, the way you can diagnose what element is the problem is by rotating the element that you think might be the problem element. So if you rotate, in this case it was also an off-axis guider. If you rotate that element and the pattern, in this case the bright square pattern, changes, then you can bet that that's the problem. And of course he was able to eliminate that element, and that was the problem. So these square off-axis guiders are just real bad with internal reflections. Okay, so a couple of myths, and then I think I'm done. We did some experiments with focus, and focus doesn't make any difference. So if you're focusing through the night and you're worried about, oh geez, I got to take flats before I refocus, that's not true, because again, 99.99% of your dust donuts are going to be on the filter wheel and the cover slip of your CCD sensor, and so they're in a fixed distance from the sensor. So the focus isn't going to make any difference at all. We talked about this already. Rotator position, repeatability is not important, but with the caveat that you've got to have a perfectly aligned imaging train, and that's not necessarily an easy task. And EL panels do work for narrowband filters. They do have light in those part of the spectrum. And here's the last slide, I think. This is kind of the summary slide. Yeah, and I'll just put those up there for people to see. Whoopsie. Let me get back to that one. Sorry, whoops. I'm going all over the place here. There we go. Play from Cruz. Yeah. So I'll just put those up again. Try not to click too many times. And then we can look at those. So try to get the best even illumination you can, and that's t-shirt flats with whatever it is that you do. You're really looking to try to get it as even as possible. Get rid of those bad pixels. Use recent darks and bias frames. Take lots of, make sure that you're, when you're bias or dark subtracting, you're using a master flat with lots of frames to minimize the measurement uncertainty. Same with the frames, flat frames. And we didn't talk too much about checking your flat quality, because that really is less of a concern for aesthetic imagers. And then don't overexpose into the nonlinear regime. Don't do any sort of noise reduction or smoothing to your flat images. Don't stretch the histogram. Don't do anything, because of course that's going to mess up the math. That's it for tonight. So if anybody has any more questions, feel free.
We do have one. This is also from Sean, who had the DSLR or one-shot color. Would a properly colored T-shirt align the colors? I think he's asking if I had a red shirt or a blue shirt or something.
Yeah. Well, if you don't have the right color light coming from your source, then the only thing that a colored shirt is going to do is going to eliminate the other colors, which your filter does anyway. So that's not a solution. The solution is to have a source of illumination that includes photons that in the wavelength of your filter. So again, LEDs, white light LEDs, if you go online and look at the spectrum of white light LEDs, typically what they're doing is combining a narrow peak in the blue spectrum with a narrow or sort of more broad peak in the red spectrum, and that's fooling your eyes into seeing white. So, you know, I'm guessing that it's the green spectrum that is suffering, but you know, it depends on the LEDs, and there's a lot of. But if you went and looked at the manufacturer's spec for your LEDs, and then looked at their spectrum, and then looked at your passband of your filters, you could see if those LEDs were giving off light in the passband of your filters, and if they weren't, then they're not going to work no matter what you do.
I think that was the only other question we had. Let me double check here. While I'm looking, definitely get if you have any other questions, get them in now so we can ask them. So I had a question for you, Pete. You talked about making sure that you remove the bad pixels and stuff when you're doing the average, so that it doesn't shift the mean that you're going to use to normalize the flat field with.
Yeah.
Right. But is that actually a problem, because it's not a add or subtract, it's a multiply, and you're multiplying by a constant. So.
Right, but again, if you're multiplying by a constant, that's the wrong constant, right? Because you're going to get the normalization average is from the total average of the ADU values of the dark. So if you've got a sort of a Poisson distribution of dark frame values, and then you've got these outliers, they're going to skew the average down. So, you know, and it's a question for the software guys. Like, it may very well be that the various programs say, okay, we're going to look at the distribution, and then we're going to, you know, apply some statistical cut, so that we're only taking an average of, you know, I don't know, 3 standard deviations away from the mean value, so that you're doing some kind of statistical cut, so that you're not putting those low values in. I don't know, but I think it's probably better practice to eliminate bad pixels with a bad pixel map.
Yeah, I absolutely do that. I just, from what I tell from the math, you're effectively multiplying, you know, you're dividing your flat by a constant, right?
Yeah,
and
but that constant is arrived at by the software tallying up the value of every pixel in your sensor and dividing it by the number of pixels.
Right.
So if you have 100 pixels that are reading well out of the range of the rest of the pixels, you know, if you look at, if I go back to that slide of the histogram of a, let's see, where is that? That is here. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Yeah, yeah. So that's going to skew the average. If you were to, you know, just think of, you know, most of the pixels are between what, 1900 and 2400. You know, and that's a logarithmic vertical axis. So you're not talking about, I mean, we're talking about tens of pixels, or maybe 1,000 pixels total that are over there between 1050 and 1300, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pixels that are in the distribution on the right. So it's a small effect, but it's an effect nonetheless.
Gotcha.
So in the real life for aesthetic imagers, are those values going to skew the average enough to matter? I don't know, to tell you the honest truth. But strictly from a conceptual point of view, if you want things to be right, then those pixels should not be part of the average for normalization.
Okay, one other question I had was, have you ever encountered any problems with, I've seen some electroluminescent panel setups have a glossy surface on the front. Have you seen any of them cause additional reflections through the optical system and cause flat field problems that way?
Okay, so there's a couple of things that need to happen. You can't just put an electroluminescent panel in front of your telescope and expect to have a raw piece of EL panel in front of your telescope and expect to have a good flat, because you need a diffusing element in front with an air gap. So we use smoky plexiglass and I know that that Optic has done some research and changed the specs on the plexi, the milk white plexi, to get some better diffusion characteristics. So you definitely have to have some kind of a diffuser in front of the panel, because the panels themselves are even to probably plus or minus 5%. If you take an in-focus image of an electroluminescent panel, your histogram is going to vary by about plus or minus 5%. What you're relying on to get the plus or minus 1% evenness of an electroluminescent panel, and I glossed over that section, but a plus or minus 1% evenness, spatial evenness or flatness of your illumination source, that's pretty damn good. I mean, professionals are looking for plus or minus 1% if they can get it. But to get that plus or minus 1%, you're relying on the diffusion of the air gap plus the plastic diffuser, and you're relying on the fact that your camera is focused at infinity, but you're imaging something that is 5 feet away or 3 feet away. So you're getting the diffusion that comes from an out of focus image. So you add those two things together, and that's how you get your evenness.
Okay, good explanation. I don't see any other questions. Sean says, thank you very much for the great talk. And,
well, you're welcome, Sean.
And I think that's it.
Great. Well, I'll be at AIC this year, so if any of you are coming out to AIC, feel free to find me and ask me any questions that you have. And you'll be bored, but if you don't come to my talk because I just gave it, go find somebody else to see.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast. Thanks for joining in, everyone, and we'll see you next week.